There is a lot of growth happening in Asia, India, China, the subject of the discussion today. And that also poses a lot of challenges to humanity in terms of the human development and the various things that come with growth, the challenges in terms of infrastructure and other challenges. But that poses for us a specific opportunity in terms of thought leadership by giving research ideas and input. So we position that NUS could contribute through the Global Asia Institute along three threads. But all of these have a new approach, and in fact today's seminar itself is a way to share that new approach, the way we dialogue and exchange views. We are looking at three streams, see how the global trends and the economic trends affect Asia, and also vice versa, how the trends that are happening in Asia, specifically India, China, would affect the future of the global scenario. In that context, specifically, Asia is urbanizing far more rapidly than how the rest of the world did. And so that poses specific challenges for the social, physical, and other policies that need to be shaped to make the urban societies function better. And the last and the most important thread in that is also how do we actually provide various resources like water, energy, and food and others for the future citizens of the world and in Asia, and to make our cities livable. And this is how we are driving the research agenda. And in the Global Asia Institute, we are also cognizant of other areas and domains of expertise that are already flourishing within NUS. A few of them are listed here, and they are basically clusters which cluster the existing faculties and schools and disciplines and centers of excellence that work within NUS. One of them is finance and risk management, another one is integrative sustainability solutions, one on aging, and the other one biomedical sciences. And so the Global Asia Institute tries to integrate these clusters and to create thought leadership in a manner that we can actually post and answer, try to answer questions that are critical for the future of Asia. And in this context, and that is why we have visiting speakers come here, we really want to harness and tap the expertise and the knowledge of scholarship that is also outside NUS, outside Singapore, and outside Asia, so that we can exchange views and broaden our own knowledge exchanges that is needed to pursue this thought leadership. That brings me to the second point of today's topic. That is, we have Professor Pranab Bardhan here, who is our guest speaker. It's difficult to introduce a great scholar and a prolific writer like him, but I will introduce briefly, taking excerpt from his CV. Professor Prasanjit Duara alerted that I have to say many more things, which I think we will say when we have the opportunity to have the dialogue with him. He is a professor of economics at the University of California, Berkeley. He hails from India and studied in Calcutta and then Cambridge University at UK. His own theoretical work covers a large domain of areas from political economy, development policies, and international trade. Part of his work has been the interdisciplinary area of economics, political science, and interestingly, social anthropology. I think that brings us the context for this lecture today. He has been an editor of the Journal of Development Economics for over 2 decades. He is also co-chair of the MacArthur Foundation on the effects of inequality and economic performance for a 10-year period from 1996 to 2007. He held distinguished positions, including the Fulbright Siena Chair at the University of Siena, Italy, and he is currently also the BP Centennial Professor at the LSE, and he's authored more than a dozen books and has over 150 journal articles. More interestingly and importantly, the title of today's speech actually is also a title of the most recent book that he has published, and the Princeton University Press. There is a pamphlet available outside for those of you who like to place orders for this book. It's an exciting book, exactly the same title. I don't want to give away what the book is about, so I hope you'll take a look at the book. The way the session today will proceed is he will give a lecture for about 40 minutes. He has kindly agreed to give the key points during the 40 minutes. Later we'll invite Professor Prasanjit Duara. For many of you, he does not need introduction, those who are from NUS, but for the benefit of those who are from outside NUS, he is currently our Raffles Professor of Humanities and Director also for the Humanities and Social Sciences Research at NUS, and he works closely with the Deputy President of Research and Technology to promote research excellence, and is responsible actually for driving the university's research agenda in social sciences, humanities, including programs in business, law, public policy, and design. He is also one of the management committee members for the Global Asia Institute, so I'm deeply honored that he is also with us today. He will join us for the dialogue, and we will have a lively Q&A discussion after Professor Pranab Bardhan makes his introductory speech. With that, I'd like to invite and request you to join me for a round of applause to welcome Professor Pranab Bardhan to make his opening speech.
Thank you, Professor, for those generous remarks, and thank you all for coming to this. Mr. Sitaram has already made a plug for my book. Probably I can go home now. Given the short time, I have some slides. By the way, they are in PDF, not PowerPoint. What I'll do, I will show you some charts from the slides, and then later, the second part of my talk, when I'm going to talk about some bit of political economy and a little bit of politics actually, I'm going to just skip some slides. So please bear with me if I skip and jump when I show some of these slides. The other thing I should start with is that what my talk and the book is not about. Usually in the Western media particularly, much of the emphasis is what the rise of these two large countries imply for the rest of the world, both economically and geopolitically and militarily. That is not what my book is about. This is not what my talk is about. My emphasis is more on what's happening to the lives of 2.5 billion people who live in these countries, and under what structural constraints do they operate. That's the emphasis of the book as well as my talk. The other thing I'm not going to talk about is the implications for China and India and the rest of the world of the current global recession. My emphasis in the book as well as in the talk is on long-term structural issues, not on short-run macroeconomic issues. The only thing that I'm going to touch upon in terms of the global impact is the first chart that I'm going to show you. This is the chart. I wonder whether I can, maybe if you can see it or not. Let me tell you. So this gives you 200 years of history in bite-sized numbers. So the first, so this first tower is 1820. In 1820, and what it measures is percentage of world income. So in 1820, 33%, 1/3 of world income was in China, and 16% in India. So the two together, China and India together, composed about half of world income. If you are interested, this little blue thing is the United States, and this nearly maroon colored is the 4 large countries of Europe, and the yellow is Japan. So that's 1820. Half of world income is in these two countries. Jump to 1950. These two countries now have less than 10% of world income. You all know what happened in between. Some of it has to do with rather unpleasant encounters with international powers for both countries. And of course, United States now is 27% in 1950. Jump to the last tower, which is a projection at current growth rates, 2025. So the whole thing covers about 200 years. So 2025, the projection is the two countries together will have about 36% of world income. Not quite half of world income, but a big step toward 2025 will be 16%. So that's the only chart I'm going to show you about the impact globally. The rest of it is what's happened inside the countries. So we all know both countries are growing very fast. China much faster. China's per capita income in what economists call PPP, which is purchasing power parity, trying to make the, quite imperfectly, trying to make the prices somewhat comparable between countries. In PPP terms, per capita income was higher in India than China in the 1870s and also in the 1970s. But since then, China has surged way much faster than India. If you take the whole period, say, quarter century, since 1980 to 2005, say, in that period, the Chinese growth rate, by and large, has been twice that of India. So today, China's economy's per capita income certainly is much higher than India's. One of one focus in the book, as well as in my talk, is about some myths have accumulated over the years about the growth performance and other economic performance of these two countries. And I don't quite share in some of these, and I'm going to qualify the conventional wisdom. Much of the book is really about that, qualifying the conventional wisdom about the two countries that were accumulated. I don't have time to go to all of this, but let me mention one or two. For example, today China is called the manufacturing center of the world, which is to a large extent true, but not fully. Usually people think in terms of volume of output. Economists usually emphasize what they call value added. In other words, value of output minus the material costs. It's very important for both countries because both countries, to a large extent, essentially process raw materials. So the value added is what we should emphasize. In value added terms, China is yet not the largest share in the world. The largest share is still United States, about 24%. This is 2009 figures. European Union is about 20%. China is about 15%. The same, by the way, is about Japan. But China is going to get there, but not yet, in terms of value added. Same thing exports, by the way. The big export performance of China, usually people think in terms of export to GDP ratio, but that's not comparable. The numerator, export volume or value, is not what you should do value added. So in value added terms, it's not as stellar a performance, but still it's a very good performance in terms of exports for China. The other important thing about Chinese exports is that China's success stories are for a long time, China is now moving away from this, for a long time in labor-intensive exports, where, we all know shoes, garments, toys, wigs, and so on. India, by the way, is not in labor-intensive. Success stories of India are not in labor-intensive exports. So Indian success stories have not yet been a success story in terms of jobs created. Indian success stories are more in capital-intensive and particularly skill-intensive products. So you hear about software, you hear about information technology-related products, you hear about pharmaceuticals. These are the success stories of India. Now, a little bit in cars and car parts. Most of these are either capital-intensive or skill-intensive. So in terms of job creation, India lags far, far behind China. Just to give you an example, we hear about Indian software. If you take not just software, all of the information technology related services, even the low end of that, like call centers, if you count all of this, the number of jobs that this whole sector in India, very successful sector, creates in India is a tiny part of the Indian labor force. For example, if you count all of this, it's less than 0.5% of Indian labor force. So that sector alone, with all its success, cannot transform the whole Indian economy. So these are some of the myths that I talk about in the book. Let me jump to poverty and inequality, because these are very important aspects for both countries. So I have some panels here to give you some idea about poverty. So the top panel is percentage of population below $1 a day per capita. These are World Bank figures. There are lots of problems with this poverty line, but other poverty lines will also give you very similar results. I want you to note three things out of it. Number one, just look at the percentage of people below this line in 2005. The change from 1981 to 2005, less than 1/4 century, what's happened in China is amazing. From 73.5% of the population below the 1 day per capita poverty line in 1981, 2005, it's in single digit, which is really a wonderful performance. India also has a decline, but not as dramatic, nothing as dramatic as China's. Second fact to note is, go to the second panel. These are absolute numbers of people. So again, China's dramatic performance. So between 1981 and 2005, about 625 million people were raised above that poverty line, never before in history. This is an unparalleled achievement in history. Now my third point, which is less well known, and this is a myth. So people often say, and this you will see in the financial media all the time, all over the world, that this big poverty reduction and growth, of course, and poverty reduction as a consequence, because often claimed that it's because of globalization. These numbers will immediately tell you. I can show it. I have shown it in more precise econometrically, but these numbers will itself show. So the 81 and 2005, 625 million people were raised above the poverty line. Of these 625 million raised above the poverty line, more than half were raised by 1987. And yet, the large stride in globalization in China happened in the 1990s and later. China became a member of WTO, the World Trade Organization, in 2001. So what happened in the early 80s? What happened in the early 80s, at least in a major way, is a big institutional change in agriculture. And agriculture is important because in both countries, agriculture is the sector where poverty is concentrated. Large numbers of poor are in the agricultural sector. And this is the time where China moved from the commune system to the household responsibility system. And not just household responsibility, an important aspect of it is that China had an egalitarian distribution of land use rights. So most rural families got some bit of land, and I think it's one of the history's most egalitarian land reforms, if you like. And that provided a floor to how poor you will be, because everybody had some piece of land. This is a big contrast with India. India, today, even today, nearly half of the rural households are either landless or near landless. So that makes a big difference to the floor of poverty. And I think that's nothing to do with globalization, or very little to do with globalization. So that's immediately that tells you that this big, dramatic, historically unparalleled achievement is not due to globalization. It is due to, among other things, that's not the only thing, among other things, a very large institutional reform that China carried out in the agricultural sector. India performance is, as I already said, India's performance is not dramatic as China's, but reasonably good in terms of poverty reduction. However, India's performance is dismal in terms of non-income indicators of poverty. Particularly if you look at health and education, Indian performance is really dismal. If anybody's interested, I'd be happy to discuss it in the Q&A. Let me now talk a little bit about inequality. I have lots of figures, etc. I'll not bore you with this. So, to me, the inequality, the two things. A myth, again, I see that in the financial media all the time. And they will often say, China is now, inequality is growing so fast that Chinese inequality, income inequality, is much more than India's. Not true. First of all, India does not usually collect income data, so the data that you get cited is not income inequality. It's consumption expenditure inequality. Some organizations collect income data in India now. If the few years for which you have data, Indian income inequality is not just higher than China's, it's much higher. But to me, more important than income inequality is, philosophers make a distinction between inequality of outcome and inequality of opportunity. Meaning that if you and I have the same opportunity, but you are more hardworking, then you will obviously have more income. But we don't bother about that. We are really worried about inequality of opportunity. And if you take these two countries, inequality of opportunity depends primarily on three things. One, land distribution, how much land you inherit, for example. Second, education, how much education your parents succeed in giving you. And number three is social inequality. So let me first talk about land. In land distribution, I already hinted at, Chinese land distribution, even today, not just when the early 80s, even today, I have some figures, let me not quote them right now. Land distribution inequality is much higher in India than in China, primarily because India has large number of landless people. How about education? It turns out, and this is not well known, turns out education inequality, by the way, how do you measure education inequality? Very crudely. Each of us, suppose, have a number, how many years of schooling we had. So that number, if you had, then measure an inequality figure. So if you do that very crudely, then educational inequality in India is not merely much more than China's, it's much more than much of the rest of the world. In fact, all Latin American countries, education inequality is better than India's. This is also because large numbers of people in India are still illiterate or near illiterate. So that brings the education inequality very high. What about social inequality? Well, there, of course, if you think about social inequality in terms of caste, etc., India, of course, is much more unequal than China. But there is one aspect of social inequality which China may be worse, or at least the result is mixed. And that's, let me mention for a minute, is gender inequality. Now, gender inequality can have many different aspects. In one aspect, China is worse. In simple numbers, how many boys per 100 girls? China in 2009 had 122 boys per 100 girls. Simple gender imbalance is much worse in China than in India. India, the corresponding number is 109. And here I have is a map of the two countries. The darker it is, the more gender imbalance. So you see large parts of central and east China, gender imbalance is very large. In India, the corresponding is in Punjab and Haryana in northwest India. However, there are other aspects of gender inequality in which China is better. For example, female literacy is much better in China than in India. For example, female participation in labor, in the workforce, say in urban India and urban China, if you compare, is much better. In fact, it's about nearly 3/4 of women in urban China work. In India, the corresponding work, but of course outside. This doesn't include work at home. Is in India, the corresponding number is less than 25%. Let me now leave the subject of inequality and go into other aspects. One is environment. And that, of course, I think most people know, and I'm not going to spend much time on it. Most people know that the environmental aspect of development Before I go into that, I just wanted to mention another myth I see accumulating now, that India has a great opportunity in terms of what is called demographic dividend. That is, Indian population, because of particularly of the one-child policy in China, the drastic one-child policy in China, very soon the population will age much faster than India's. India's population will remain very young until the 2030s. So that is a big demographic dividend, because younger people work, and so they are more productive, they contribute more to the national income than older people, and similarly younger people save, older people dissave. While that is generally true, there are some qualifications. One, that the younger part of the population in India happen to be located in the less successful and less well-governed large states of North India. How far India will be able to give these young people good jobs, that's the question mark. Second is that decline in quantity of labor force in China may be counteracted by the rise in quality, with a broader spread of education in China than in India. So those are the qualifications to the standard dividend story, demographic dividend story. Let me jump to environment. I think most people now are aware how serious the environmental consequences of this fast Chinese growth has been. Let me show you a chart. This is from the British magazine Nature. And what is this? Is satellite image of tropospheric nitrogen dioxide emission levels from fossil fuel combustion and biomass burning in Asia. And in order to cut short the time, the redder it is, the worse it is. And you can see this is China, mostly in northeast and also in the southeast. Compare that with Korea, compared it with Japan, and compared it with India. So it's much, much worse in China than in India, and partly because China has grown so fast. It's also, I'm going to come, this also relates to a governance issue that I will come back a little later. However, India is worse in some environmental aspects, particularly, by the way, if you look at air pollution, Chinese urban air is much worse in terms of, in the big cities, in terms of particulate matters. But if you take, when people think about air pollution, they think only about urban air. Both of these countries, and this is something that's not usually noted, a great deal of indoor air pollution. And what do we mean by indoor air pollution? Is burning of cooking fuel. And WHO, World Health Organization, has estimated in India every year more than 500,000, mostly women, die or have preventable deaths because of diseases related to indoor air pollution. And for China, the number is much higher than 500,000, which is for India. So it's a huge problem. But let me not, since I will go into other issues. If anybody wants to discuss the environmental issues, I'll be happy to discuss them in the Q&A session. The only other economic issues before I go into the politics I'm going to tell you is about fiscal and financial. In fiscal matters, China is much better off. In fact, India has a much larger budget deficit, fiscal deficit, than China. However, this is a bit, it's a bit partial, because while China has less of a fiscal deficit, government budget deficit, they have a problem which India does not have as much, and that is through bad loans through banks, public banks. So in a sense, a financial deficit, financial, the high default risk loans that China, for example, in the stimulus that after the global recession that China has pushed through state banks, and now that has fed the real estate prices. China is now, most people think China is now having a very serious and dangerous property bubble, The government is trying to curb it now, but nothing comparable in India. So fiscal deficit is one aspect, worse in India than in China, but the financial bubble is much more than in China than in India. In general, the financial sector, I think, is healthier in India. And this is also a reflection of the fact that the private corporate sector is much more vigorous in India than in China. And the corporate governance is much more transparent in India than in China. India also has problems in corporate governance, but China has much more. So if I have to put this in one or two sentences, that will be my description of financial and fiscal. However, because the budget deficit is lower in China, China has been able to afford to spend much more on infrastructure. Anybody who visits China will be dazzled. In my book, there is a chapter called The Dazzling Difference. The dazzling difference has to do with physical infrastructure, ports, railways, highways, etc. And the dazzling difference, what are the reasons for it? As an economist, I mentioned two or three factors. One is the government is riddled with fiscal deficit in India. They don't have the money to spend in a big way because these are costly things. Second, but that's not the only aspect. Second, China's investors can recover money much better than India's. India has a serious cost recovery problem, and that's why even when the government cannot invest, even the private investors are not that willing because they're worried about cost recovery. Just to give you an example, come election time, Indian politicians will merrily announce, if I get elected, you'll get free water, irrigation water, free electricity. And just imagine what it does to investment prospects in those infrastructural fields. So that's the second issue. First issue is fiscal deficit for India, not to be able to invest for the government. And any investment, you need to recover your costs, which in India, there is much more populist resistance to paying user prices for many of the infrastructure. The third is an issue which is exercising Indian politicians a great deal now, is land acquisition. Because for these projects, infrastructural and industrial projects, commercial projects, you need to acquire land. China has been much more cavalier in grabbing land from the peasants, etc. In India, the peasants are resisting. In fact, one of the big political headaches of Indian politicians now is that the peasants are not willing to give up their land. And that's a big block to infrastructure development and industrial development in general in India compared to China. Let me now go into the aspect which is now related to political economy, which I mentioned that will be the second part of my talk. So let me talk about the nature of capitalism that as it is developing in both countries. India, of course, has a long capitalist history, and as I already said, private corporate sector is much more vigorous in India than in China. And the private sector, private capitalism is now developing into having quite a grip on the Indian political life in the state, in the control over the media and in state allocation of access to land, monopoly rights on natural resources or telecommunication spectrum. But there's a Chinese story which is more fascinating because after all, development of capitalism in China is being presided over by an ostensibly communist party. Now, today, of course, much of the economy is in the market dominated, and a very large part of the economy in China, industrial economy, is in the hands of the private sector. Although very little, it's very difficult to get data on the private ownership because there are lots of problems about where does the boundary of the private and public that's quite blurred in China. Now, so I'll skip some of this. The nature of private ownership is rather convoluted in China, so I will skip some of this. However, there is one aspect that I do want to comment on. It is well known that many of the successful entrepreneurs in China are in fact friends or relatives of party officials. Many of the state-owned enterprises are controlled. State-owned enterprises have been restructured, highly commercialized, and in fact, many state-owned enterprises in China are more commercialized than in India, state-owned enterprises in India. But they are controlled often by powerful political families in China. One of China's most respected senior economists, Jinglian Wu, has described all this as crony capitalism. There is a new political managerial class which over the last 2 decades has converted their positions of authority into wealth and power. The vibrancy of entrepreneurial ambitions combined with the arbitrariness of power in an authoritarian state has sometimes given rise to particularly corrupt or predatory forms of capitalism, unencumbered by the restraints of civil society institutions. Now, there is a question here. I'd be happy to discuss it. Let me skip that. So when state is a capitalism, but it's state-propelled, in what sense is it capitalist? This is a question that I discuss in some detail in the book. I'm going to skip that, but that's a very genuine question. I personally think that while the state has a lot of control, it is probably correct to say that while the party can undo individual capitalists, in fact, I give an example that in late 2008, China's richest man was arrested. Many thought that his biggest crime was that he was getting too powerful for the political leader's comfort. He's recently been sentenced to 14 years of prison. So I say it's shades of Putin's Russia. Nevertheless, it is probably correct to say that while the party can undo individual capitalists at short notice, it will be much more difficult for the leadership to unravel a whole network of capitalist relations, by now thickly overlaid with various vested interests and knotted with Guangxi ties. Individual entrepreneurs have a clientelistic relationship with the state, but the state is now sufficiently enmeshed in a profit-oriented system that has been identified with legitimacy-enhancing international economic prowess and nationalist glory, a tiger that the political leadership may find difficult to dismount. This is related to something that I discuss quite a lot in the book, and this is to do with the local officials versus the central leadership. The way, and this is something, a very important issue of Chinese governance that I wanted to mention. I think China has even though China does not have democracy, India does, there is one aspect in which Chinese governance is much more advanced than India's, and that is decentralization. Chinese industrialization, particularly initially with township and village enterprises, but even later, is much more decentralized. And the way the incentive structure has been arranged is that local officials have been given a lot of autonomy. So if they make money, they can keep much of it for the local revenue as well as their own pockets. Indian local bureaucrats don't have that much autonomy and they have no incentive, because if the local performance is good, they don't get the reward from that. Whereas in China, you get the reward. So quite often the opposite danger is coming now for quite some time, is that the Chinese local officials in collusion with local business do what I call capitalist excesses. I mean, they of course help local business development, but they also then go and do a lot of capitalist excesses. What do I mean by capitalist excesses? Environment pollution, toxic pollution is one of them. Land grabbing, land acquisition without paying enough compensation to the peasants, causing a lot of local unrest. Second. Third, violating product safety regulations, work conditions in the mines and in the factories. These are capitalist excesses committed by local party officials in collusion with local business, which Now the central leadership is trying to control, not very successfully. For a long time, the local leaders were rewarded. Their reward structure was such that you are compensated if your local area grows very well. So it was connected with local growth. And when the growth go into capitalist excesses, that's when the problem arises out of this system. India does not have that system. Let me mention the last thing is, I'll be happy to discuss it. I thought I would have time to discuss it, but I'll postpone it until the QA session. Of course, the complex relationship between democracy and development. I think there is a myth that is growing now, which is often, I find, propagated by the Chinese elite, not just the government, Chinese elite, that China's dramatic success shows that in the early stages of development, authoritarianism is good for development. I don't believe in it. I don't think authoritarianism is neither necessary nor sufficient for development. And I then show, I have a long chapter in the book, the last chapter is on this issue. And I show the advantages of democracy, for even if you don't ignore democracy is a value in itself. But even if you look at democracy as an instrumental sense, whether it helps development or not, you can show that there are many ways Chinese development has been distorted because of lack of accountability. I've already talked about the local officials' capitalist excesses. It's because they are not accountable to the local people. Unfortunately, local democracy hasn't worked very much in India as well, even though India has regular elections at the local level. So far, it has not worked very well. This is an area in which I'm doing quite a bit of work for the last few years, so I'd be happy to answer your questions. But Indian local democracy hasn't worked either. So ultimately, and this is the thing that I'm going to end with, ultimately, accountability failure is where both countries have problems. Even though India is a democracy, India has lots of accountability failures at the local level, particularly in the delivery of social services to the poor in India. But in China, the pattern has been distorted. The development pattern is distorted by accountability failures. So, and that is the reference to the part of the title of the book, which sometimes people get mystified. Awakening Giants, yes. What are the feet of clay? And for China, the feet of clay, I would say, there are failures in various aspects, I say, financial sector, the private corporate sector, etc. But it's really the accountability level. Is the accountability failure which distort development. That's part of the feet of clay for both India and China. Let me end there. Thank you.
What we were going to do during this, I'm going to take 3 questions at a time because we have a camera there. So please go to the individual mics and then make your questions. Maybe introduce yourself briefly. I note that we have several scholars who have come from outside NUS. We also want to give them an ample opportunity.
You touch a bit on the corruption in China. And the Chinese government has declared corruption as one of the top, I think, 1 or 2 issues in China. So 2 questions arise out of that. First question is, how do you see that will be resolved in China? That's one thing. And second thing, also, there's also corruption in India. And it's also a big social issue there, economic issue. So how is that addressed in India?
I have 3 points to make. One is the very title of the book, The Feet of the Clay. With your own data, 1950, both India and China were 10%. And 2030, 35 to 40% is going to come from India and China. And by 2025 or even 2030, in Asia, if you'll see, more than 50 to 60% of the production is going to be consumed in Asia itself. You see, it's not going to be export-oriented kind of a thing. And even to account for about 30 to 40% by 2030, certainly it is not a feat of clay. It's a wheels with some milestones, which are disturbing milestones over the track, but definitely it's not a feat of clay. Second, with regard to the poverty and inequality and globalization and economic reforms, if we go back into the history, you see, even during Industrial Revolution, Britain, there was 12 or 14 hours of child labor exploitation. There's a social cost to be paid. And in terms of globalization, economic reforms have led to higher growth, providing a basis for development. Without that, you can't this thing. So there is a social cost to be paid. And will you please tell us that how we are going to reduce the social cost in terms of India and China? Now, that is the most crucial, fundamental thing. It's not the other kind of statistics. Human Development Report has given us a lot of statistics on inequality and poverty. We don't need your book to go into the statistics. Number 3, you talk about the hype. It really doesn't matter what the press talks about in the West, but it is important that what we think in India and China and Asia. And if you look in India and China and the whole discourse, what goes on, there's absolutely no hype. And in the whole discourse in India, there's a whole criticism, the whole paper, whether it is in globalization or even in terms of wherever, there's a heavy criticism goes on. There's a whole discourse on the inclusive development. In China, it's on the whole harmonization of the society. In environment and sustainability, India and China has done much more than US in the last few years. I think I'll just stop.
Thank you, sir. Yeah. So my question is, you talked about the capitalism in both countries. So what is the new characteristics of the emerging capitalism, which is basically going to happen in China and India? Are they basically homogeneous concept? And second question is, how did you basically zero down the title feet of clay on the opening the giant of China and India? Could you please
Thank you. I thought 3 questions, but you got about 6 questions to handle. So maybe we'll wait for you to think about it. Let me give it to Prasanjit to make some initial comments. Maybe also questions you can pose in the comments.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, both Dr. Sitaram and Professor Bardhan, for first coming to Singapore all the way from Berkeley and making your presentations here. I may be one of the few people to have a copy of this book. I just want to show it to give you a sense of its relative size, because that sometimes makes a difference to whether you want to buy it. It's a very normal and average size, so you can and it's written very clearly and relatively simply for non-economists. Well, I enjoyed reading much of the book. I didn't have a chance to read it all. I cherry-picked. And there are, in fact, one of the most important things that Professor Bardhan has done is, in fact, look at the whole structural issues as opposed to the much more common sort of the race to the quick kinds of or the race to the top kinds of analyses that are appearing, which are very shallow. And this is much deeper, I think, and so I think we have to thank him for that. Just a few questions and comments. I'm not sure whether they're comments or questions. We'll see how they work out as I was listening to you. The first is the issue that resonates with me as well, which is the one about poverty issues and land distribution. This is something I've also been noticing in China, that China actually, although of course there are huge land grab issues in China, there is also an enormous security that was built at the beginning of the reforms, which in the 1980s, which Professor Bardhan referred to as the household responsibility system, which gave farmers the right to land use. Now, this, in a sense, actually had more implications, much more implications than people imagined at that point. At that point, the goal was just to give them some incentive to produce more, and for a few years it did. But then, the size of the farms made them relatively unproductive, and people started moving away from farming. But the collectively held land, that is collectively held rights to land use, where every farmer had a certain right to a certain proportion of land, remained very important, especially as migrants started to move out. And when they were caught in bad times in the city and so on, they would have to come back and they would have some rights in the village and right to collective. And in fact, as these lands were being leased out and so on, they were gaining income, they actually got a share of all of that. And that was a very critical sort of flaw. Then, about 2 years ago, the Chinese government, there's presumably a huge debate within the Chinese system, began to think about this whole issue of privatization of land. And at some level, and this remains very unclear, there was a property law passed. But the interesting thing is that it is only exercised locally. And this, it seems to be, is an interesting issue. Some people say that, okay, because the fear is that if, in fact, they sell their land rights, then they will not have this floor to come back, right? And apparently, local village governments, township governments, and so on, now still continue. Some of them allow them to be sold, and others don't reveal that you can sell or not. So I think it's an issue that needs clarification and thinking, and are thinking about the importance of it, right? In order not to have the kind of movement that you have had in India. Well, not the movement that you've had, but you had a huge landless population in India that was always a problem. This then brings me to another issue, the issue that Professor Bardhan deals with very interestingly, the issue of inequality, or equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome, or inequalities in those areas. And he shows very clearly that land is a very important part of this, why, in fact, the inequality of outcome is so much greater in India. And of course, land is an important part, but there are also, of course, huge other social issues in India, because India never had the revolution that China had, and that's also very, I think, important to understanding the larger structural issues. And so I think that what's very important here is also to look at the kinds of agencies that are emerging in India and China to address the issues of this inequality of opportunity. So are there ways in which there are the government or society, NGOs, I'm thinking about civil societies. In China, you have gongos, the government-owned NGOs, which are not necessarily, I mean, they are only something to laugh at if you have a Western concept of civil society in mind, that civil society must necessarily be opposed to government. But otherwise, it can just represent a third realm where it can help a lot. And I'm also not laughing at the Western concept. I think there is something there. But at any rate, what is beginning to emerge, especially I would say in what you talk about, this is the sort of post-globalization situation, not era, post-globalization situation, where in fact the government, both in China, or post-privatization, both in China and India, are pouring huge amounts of money into rural areas because they've realized that that is a problem. And they have also recognized that it's insufficient to use the existing government agencies. Now I'm thinking of all kinds, some kind of private-public partnerships that are emerging in, certainly in India. In China, I'm much less clear. But there is all these resources going into rural areas in China. And who governs them, who distributes them, how they are sort of create the conditions for social opportunity. But in India, the story is much clearer. Private-public partnership, for instance, in microfinance or NGOs in other areas and so on. Microfinance is incidentally much more than microcredit and is hooking up. It's much more related to the bottom of the pyramid kind of idea. So those things, it seems, make for very important and interesting comparability in this last phase to address the issue that you bring about of inequality of opportunity. I know I have too many questions and comments, but let me ask just one other issue, which is all of a sudden in the last 10 years, we have begun to see in India and China and much of the rest of the world as well, this whole issue of land grab. I mean, it might have been there before, but somehow it didn't have the kind of publicity where you have industrialists, miners, governments just grabbing peasants' lands. And why has this suddenly, I mean, in a sense, is it a post-Cold War phenomenon? All of a sudden, this has now become the real major issue everywhere. Why has this happened? Is this, and my question is this in a sense a reaction to the rise of China and to a lesser extent India itself? I mean, is it because in fact you're going to have to start satisfying the consumption needs of these very large numbers of people that in fact you're beginning to see this? And I also have questions. Well, we can talk about in discussion. Okay,
Thank you very much. That was a lot for him to respond. I know others have already raised their hands for the next round of questions, so we want to have a few more rounds. So, Professor Bardhan, over to you. You don't have to answer in specific order. Maybe you can respond to them.
Well, let me start with the first question, which is about corruption. Yes, in both countries, a great deal of corruption. Corruption is also very high in the political agenda in both countries. Of course, China sometimes executes people.
Oh, you have it. Okay, sorry. Sorry.
China sometimes executes people for corruption because there are other people who say this is one way you get rid of your political enemies. But the issue is, the question was about how will it be resolved, and I think that's where I ended, about the need for democratic accountability. That after a point, corruption is checked not by executing people. Corruption is checked by making the system accountable to the local people. And I think China, I'm not saying that local accountability is completely absent in China. It's related to Prosenjit's point about civil society in China. But accountability is badly lacking in large parts of China. The other issue which is related to accountability is information. And there I make a big distinction about who has the information. This is Chinese system, being what it is, the local officials have a built-in tendency to suppress the information, particularly bad news. In fact, bad news gets to the central leadership rather late. We have examples of the SARS epidemic. I could give you 10 other examples. In fact, by the way, during the Chinese Beijing Olympic time, there was serious violation of, for example, the tainted milk scandal. Some of you may know about. Now, many of the journalists knew about it, but they did not want to write about it because the Olympics are coming up. So they didn't want to spoil the image of the country. And meanwhile, more than 300,000 children got sick. So this is what I call the nationalist glory. You want to keep the image of the country, unspoiled image. So you don't allow, even the journalists who had the information, they warned their friends and relatives, but didn't publicize this tainted milk issue. 300,000 children became sick, several children died. So that's an example of information, the role of information in accountability, in solving issues like corruption. And in this way, even India, even though it's a highly corrupt country, and in some sense probably more corrupt than China, I'll give you a reason in a minute, but India has a Right to Information Act. So anybody can demand information. So if you go and say, we want to see the document by which you say you've spent the money, you show us the vouchers, you are supposed to. Now, it doesn't work perfectly, but there is a process through which you can do that. Information is lacking in China. So that's why there is a culture of impunity in Chinese leadership. They can get away with things which the Indian leaders, less corrupt leaders, have more difficulty in getting away with it. But there's one sense in which I think corruption, that there is a structural incentive for corruption to be less in China than in India. And that is related to something that I mentioned, that the local officials are rewarded by the local area performance. So, yes, you steal money. You are a local official, you steal money, but there are limits to how much you would steal. Because if you steal too much, then the local area economic performance will suffer, so your own promotion will be affected. There's nothing like that in India. And so in a sense, there is no structural disincentive for local corruption as much as it exists in China. So that's an example, because I gave some positive aspects of India's attempt to control corruption, but this is a negative aspect. This is a positive aspect for China. Mr. Krishna's made 3 comments and talked about the big improvements. Why do I call it a feat of clay? Well, if you read the whole title, what he's referring to is the awakening giants part. That's why the giants are awakening. But there's a lot of, as I mentioned, there are a lot of feet of clay in both countries, because there are many pitfalls and many structural weaknesses in both countries. That relates to the feet of clay, even though I'm proud of the achievements, both of India and of China. And that's why the awakening relates to the awakening giants part. Social costs to be paid for this high growth. No, it's not all necessary cost. That nearly half of Indian children are malnourished are not necessary for growth. Indian child malnutrition is worse than sub-Saharan Africa. It's not necessary for Indian growth. This is just a bad performance, governance performance of India. That's part of the feat of clay of India. It's not a social cost for growth. These malnourished children had been there even when India was not growing. Now India is growing. Let me give you an example of India's most high-performing, performance-wise, high-performing state, Gujarat. Gujarat is one of the most economically advanced states of India. Yet, Gujarat's child malnutrition is worse than sub-Saharan Africa. This is not acceptable. This is not a social cost of growth. This is just negligence of the poor people in large parts of India. Yes, you mentioned that there is no hype in India and China. There is a lot of hype. Indian middle class urban elite is itching to be a superpower. You cannot be a superpower when your child malnutrition is worse than sub-Saharan Africa. There is a lot of hype about growth. To me, growth doesn't mean a thing unless growth is about the bottom half of the population. And there is a lot of hype in China. Chinese elite, as I mentioned, think that their system is the best in the world because they have delivered this dramatic economic performance. Their system is very bad in terms of accountability, which is not just bad in itself, it is hurting, distorting the nature of development in China. So there is hype I will say there is hype both in China and in India, which my book, part of the reason is to try to pipe down. Yes, there's dramatic achievements in both countries, but there's a lot to be done, and there's a lot of bad things that are going on which need to be stopped. The third question is about the new characteristics of capitalism. In some sense, capitalism as it's developing in China and India are like the old kind, the standard capitalism. But if you ask me, there is one big difference, particularly in China and also to some extent India, particularly in China, is that this capitalism is taking place under state auspices, state propelled. In fact, some of the leaders of capitalism in China are state-owned enterprises. So that's something that's quite different from historical accounts of capitalism. And that's where some of the problems of crony capitalism that I've talked about, some of the predatory forms of capitalism that I've talked about, those are related to that. In India, you don't have that much of state-propelled capitalism, even though the state, by the way, in India, in the industrial sector, about 40% of the industrial if I remember right, it's that 40% of total sales in the industrial sector is still in the state hands in India. So state is not unimportant in India as well. So that's a very big difference. However, state is coming in another way. Private capitalists in India are using the state for its own purpose. So for example, just 2 years back, telecommunication spectrum was allocated by the state in favor of some capitalists who made billions of dollars of money in the telecommunication spectrum allocation. This is an example of corruption. This is an example of capitalists using the state, a capitalist oligarchy using the state for its own purpose. This happens in the United States, how capitalists use the system, use the political system for their own purpose. In India, this is happening. The other way in India it's happening is, in some sense, politicians in India now control many educational institutions. They control cricket clubs. They control mining rights. In South India, there is now, people have referred to some politicians called the mining mafia. These are examples in which politics has become business by other means. This is, of course, Indian examples are coming up because India has a very vibrant, vigorous media. So you read about it all the time. In China, media is more active than before, but you read about it less than in India. So in that sense, Chinese capitalist oligarchy is much more entrenched than the Indian oligarchy, because Indian capitalist oligarchy has a lot more checks and balances, which are still very weak in China. So that's one way I would say the nature of the capitalism that's developing in both cases. Coming to Prosenjit's points, I really don't have any disagreement. I just make one or two comments. The land issue that he very rightly pointed out is really central in my judgment. One issue is this is very important for China, and should have been more important in India, is land acting as a safety net. You see, when you go for reform, economic reform, market reform, throughout history it has happened, it's happening in China and India today, there's a lot of dislocation. People get dislocated from their current jobs, current occupations, things they have been doing for generations. So there are wrenching changes and dislocations. Now, it is easier to absorb such wrenching changes when you have a safety net. You fall, but there is a safety net on which you fall. India does not have that safety net. And that is so that, as he mentioned, you can fall back on your land that you have, land use rights that you have. India, large numbers are landless. And that is the reason why I believe there's a lot more political opposition to market reform in India than in China. This is true all over the world. There's a lot more opposition to globalization in the United States than, say, in Scandinavia. Why? Because Scandinavia, the safety net of workers is much stronger. In United States, safety net of workers is very weak. So they're worried about job losses much more, particularly health reform. Very important, because the United States until very recently did not have portable health insurance. Indian workers don't have health insurance. The vast masses don't have any health insurance. So they're worried what will happen if they lose their jobs. So the opposition, if you are an economic reformer, which I am, you also should believe in constructing a safety net. The one thing about land that I wanted to add to what Prosenjit said is that one problem that China has, even though China has this equitable land distribution, you cannot yet use that land as a collateral for raising credit. That's a big problem for small people in China. Small people do not have the advantage that state-owned enterprises have, getting credit, easy access to credit, which land, if land was owned privately, then that would have been the case in China. I agree with what Prosenjit said about civil society, and I think it's very important to emphasize in that context, there is a rights-based activism in India, which is not there. Even though Chinese civil society is stronger than before, it does not have the rights-based. India has rights to information, rights to education, rights now to food. So those rights-based activism, even though they are not implemented, those rights are not implemented well, it creates a base of an activism which makes civil society much more. Last thing, there was a land grab. Yes, land grab is important. I don't think it's just a post-Cold War thing. I think both of these countries are growing fast. This was not needed before. When you grow fast in densely populated countries, obviously you have to need land. Because in other countries, where if you want to industrialize Australia, you don't worry about land grabbing because there's so much land. United States is similar. You don't need that much. Even United States has the Eminent Domain Act for that purpose, even though it's not a land scarce country. India is so, particularly most parts of South and East India, so densely populated that anything you want to construct, you need to get the land. So the important issue there is not to change the existing land laws. India, even today, has a British Land Acquisition Act of 1894. The compensation that is given, which the British arranged, is paltry. So Chinese give very paltry land compensation, so does India. And India, under the 1894 Act, those laws have to be changed. Those who are giving up land should be induced to give up the land. Because they should share in the rising prosperity in which, or the rising value of the land. So I have actually written on this. I have suggested some formula of making the compensation more sensitive to the rising value of the land, the increased use of the land, value that will be created by the use of the land subsequently. There are ways you can do it, but so far the Indian government has not done it.
Yeah. That's fantastic. If time permits, I want to have one more a good round of questions. I see about 6 hands already up. Maybe we need to take it 2 batches. I see a lady's hand also up. So if you permit, I'll ask gentleman over there and the gentleman at the back first, and then the lady here 3 questions, and then I'll come back to the other 3. And quick round of questions and quick round of comments.
I'm from Indonesia. I think that when we are talking about this economic modernization, most people talk just about either there is capitalism or communism or socialism. The key point is what I would say, what I should call is a political economy, not capitalism or not socialism. It's just it's just one of the representation. And my question now to this political economy, and for this political economic, people talk about either if modernization to economy is only democracy or non-democracy. Is what are the essence of the talk. What they miss, or what you are missing, the most important one, I would say, from history, is what I call institutional change. And the noted economic like Acemoglu, and I think Angus Madison from OECD, from the World Bank, also talk about institutional change. And for this institutional change, we just need a strong government. And if we have a democracy, all the vested interest party will hijack the change of all this institutional change, which is required for institutional change. This is what I say. And Professor Prasenjit Dwala also talked about that. They say that China has undergone this revolution. This is important. With the revolution, almost all the old institution has been, I would think that, how to say, revolutionized. And this is important. What I see in India is that there is no institutional change. Okay, you have democracy, what you care the biggest emotion in the world. But I would say, like Indonesia, it's the form.
Can I give a chance to others to?
Okay, not that. So, what I say, what the key point in conclusion is institutional change, strong government, and we can see also from the Prussia in Germany and from Japan, and also in the earlier stage of development in the world history.
Thank you. Yeah, keep your question. Ask only your question, please, if you don't mind.
Thank you. I'm Rahul Mukherjee from South Asian Studies. My question is really that something, your book is still to arrive. I have ordered it. but I read your piece in the Journal of Asian Studies, which was sort of a prelude to the book. It seems that you are suggesting that the contestation between state and society produces a kind of check and balance, or rather, consensus making is much more evolved in a plural polity than in a political system that can run by diktat. If we go by these propositions, then essentially you're saying that is the strength of India, despite its being a peat of clay. And the weakness of China is that although it has much better indicators, it can hide a lot of the clay. Now my question is that if we were to go by these premises, as students of political science, we know that there was this democratic elite bias to the democracy, which is increasingly becoming more and more mobilized. And do you think that that quality of democracy, which may or may not be improving for you, given the kinds of political mobilizations that are taking place, are actually going to be the real sort of the germs of accountability, and that we are really beginning to see some of that in the form of welfare, so that if capitalism has to find a place in a political system like that, it has to produce social peace as well. In the other system, it doesn't. So in some senses, could you get deeper into that political economy question and give us an insight on India and China? Thank you very much.
Yeah. No, there's a lady over here, and then I have to give chance to the gentleman over there and here. The lady over here first. Yeah, you are there in the second round after he answers these first three questions. Just ask only your question if you don't mind, because we're going to be finishing soon.
My name is Asha Hamarjani. So you mentioned fiscal deficit, financial deficit, and corporate governance. As these three areas you compared between China and India. In all three areas you were saying that, you said India has a larger fiscal deficit, but China has a worse financial deficit, and India has better corporate governance than India. Now, do you have figures to, instead of anecdotal evidence, do you have solid figures to support those three statements? Because I've heard these sort of things before from many other comparisons between India and China. Funnily enough, most comparisons are done by authors of Indian origin. I've yet to see someone of Chinese origin do this sort of comparison. And then my second question is regarding corruption. You gave a lot of anecdotal evidence, anecdotal stories, and I know it's very difficult to measure corruption, but have you found some form of way to compare the level of corruption, both at the state level as well as the central government level, as well as down to the provincial government level corruption? Thanks.
Thank you. Maybe you answer that, and then we'll try to cover three more questions.
First question is about political economy and institutional change. I very much believe in that, and in fact, most of my book is about that. So let me make another plug for the book. The longest chapter in the book is really about institutions, political economy and institutions. However, having said that, I strongly disagree with the statement that you made. You need strong government for institutional change. I don't believe in that. Depends on, of course, what you mean by strong government. So in fact, my book also discusses this, but let me tell you what I mean. By institutional change, I would say right to information is a big institutional change. Everybody has a right to information. Is a big institutional change. And it's democracies which provide you that. India has provided it, has not yet successfully implemented it. India has provided it, China has not. Chinese officials have a built-in tendency to suppress information. So that is an example of an institutional change for which democracy performs better. In some sense, it is given that Chinese government is stronger because Chinese government takes big, bold decisions very quickly. Indian government looks like very messy, very slow in decision making. It takes years and years in doing something which China will do tomorrow. Land acquisition is a big issue. In India, a lot of projects are stopped because government could not acquire land. In China, this will be done in a week. In fact, I have heard stories that you wake up in the morning, you see on the wall of your house, there's a big white character, Chinese character, which means demolish. And and you have very little access to redress or good compensation. In India, for years and years there will be protests, street demonstrations, projects will be stopped. Now, so this looks like Indian government is weak, messy, Chinese government is strong. But let me add a qualifier to that. In some sense, Chinese government is weaker. Because sources of information are blocked, quite often Chinese government acts, when the information comes, acts overly heavy-handedly. During the recent global recession, when the Chinese growth rate went down a little from 10% to 8%, I have read party newspapers from Beijing which said, party newspapers, not just outsiders, party newspapers said if the rate of growth falls below 8%, then the political regime is in trouble. I joked with a Chinese friend of mine, I said, in India the rate of growth falls to 0, nothing will happen to the political regime. Why? Because the political regime derives its legitimacy not from the rate of growth. It's from democratic pluralism. So Indian political regime looks messy, looks weak, but in a structural sense, it's stronger. In a structural sense, Chinese government is afraid, this instability, things have to control. I find the Chinese government a control freak government. And by being control freak, you are really showing your insecurity. And therefore, whenever you hear external criticism, you portray it as a slur of China's national self-respect. So that is a sign of insecurity. Yes, Chinese government, Chinese leaders have shown much more decisiveness, much more purposiveness, and Chinese government in general, I find, much more pragmatic than the political leaders in many other countries. But in some fundamental sense, to me, Chinese government is more insecure than countries with democratic pluralism. The question that Rahul asked about political mobilization, yes, I think I generally agree with you. But political mobilization is a two-edged sword. There is and in fact, I think I mentioned that in my book, there is a fundamental tension in democratic governance in India. And that I say it's a tension between the procedural aspects of democracy versus the participatory aspects of democracy. Mobilization is about the participatory part. So mobilization makes the government more accountable. So you respond to problems. Therefore, even if you want to acquire the land, you cannot, because there's so much protest, etc. But there is a negative side to that. And I discussed that quite in detail in one chapter in my book. So let me give you an example from political mobilization, how it makes development, hurts development. One aspect of political mobilization is something that I referred to in my talk. So come election time, you announce you will get free water, free electricity. That's part of political mobilization. As a result, not enough is invested in electricity. So you have power outages. Even in Delhi, not to speak of the rural areas, even in Delhi, almost every day you have certain hours of power outage because long-term investment in electricity has not been made because of this. Because even if you have invested in electricity, cost recovery is a problem. And cost recovery is a problem because of the way political mobilization is taken into account. In fact, in my book I discuss many other ways in which the mobilization politics of India, while it improves checks and balances, improves accountability, causes problems for long-term development. The last question is about fiscal, financial, and corruption. I have some data. I have a chapter on saving. I think it's on saving, investment, fiscal and financial. I have some data but this book is really not a technical book. It's a general, so I have expressed mostly my general opinion, but I have some data on fiscal and financial. In fact, just the financial, there's now, even since I wrote the book, there's a lot more data available about the financial sector overstretching of lending by the Chinese banks. And in fact, last week I read in the Financial Times that the Chinese government has now given a figure that 1/4 of the loans that have been given in the local areas, in the banks, are going to be defaulted. They're going to be bad loans. I personally think it's an underestimate. I think it's much larger than 1/4. So these are figures that is coming up much more. This is also fed the property bubble. Most Chinese people now, even middle class people, cannot afford apartments. So this is so there's some figures, but not enough, in my judgment, in the book. On the corporate governance, of course, it's more difficult to give data. There are papers I could refer you to. For example, there is a paper by, if I remember right, Susan Thomas, who has worked on corporate governance in India. There's a lot of figures in her paper. I have only quoted some, but not enough. Corruption, it's difficult, of course. Data will be difficult to get, so that you get more by impression. The standard data that you get quoted by Transparency International are really subjective. One shouldn't go too much in it. So I discuss in my paper not the data of corruption, but what are the structural incentives. And I say that I give in my book 3 reasons. Let me not go into these reasons now. 3 reasons why even though both countries are corrupt, 3 reasons why Chinese corruption are kept within limits. India correspondingly do not have those limits. On the other hand, since civil society is more active, India's right to information, there is more check on corruption politically than in China.
Thank you very much. Time is running out. I'm going to give a chance to only one person at the back, and we may have to wrap up. The other questioners, I apologize to you. We consume the time. Yeah, last question, please.
My name is Tainted, alumnus of University of Malaya. I have 2 questions. The first one is, whatever you sketch now is predicated on the indigenous capital. What about the role of foreign direct investment? To what extent do they develop into the development of India and China, and then whether the environment welcomes them or not? After you sink down your money and you cannot repatriate your capital or income. That's one thing. Secondly, is about the system of law. To what extent are they creditable, and how do they enforce it? As you say, there are so many injustices and so on. So how do the people get redressed in the court of law? And then whether it be a long drawn out process or too costly for the people to ever attempt it. Thank you.
On foreign direct investment, China, of course, has been much more successful than India. In India now, of course, India now has $40 billion worth of foreign direct investment. China has much more than that for many years. But, of course, there are always data problems. Some people think China, what is this foreign direct investment? It's not really foreign. It's sometimes domestic investment recycled. One does not know what percentage. I've seen some figures about what percentage of foreign direct investment in China is not foreign. It's really domestic recycled. But no doubt foreign direct investment is much more in China than in India. The Chinese market is larger, and also export platform. Chinese economy has been much more successful export-wise, and so these foreign companies come and use China as an export platform much more than in India. If India did succeed in labor-intensive industries, I think more foreign direct investment will come. Already some states are showing signs. Tamil Nadu, which is a South Indian state, has now a lot more going into relatively labor-intensive industries, not yet fully. So you see some direct foreign investment there, and probably it will come. The environment you mentioned, Yes, the environment was quite hostile in India for a long time. Now it's become much more welcoming in India, and China has been much more friendly to foreign investment for a longer time, certainly in the last 3 decades. System and law is extremely important. In both countries, it doesn't function well. India, even though it's a democracy, in the law, system of law, why there are checks and balances, in the lower courts are still highly corrupt and slow. There's a lot of delay, a lot of court cases piled up. In China, it's worse in some sense because, there's a lot of political intervention. However, China is improving in that respect too, particularly in commercial law in China, particularly for companies which are now have operate in stock markets worldwide. Their accountability, their governance standards are improving, but there's a lot more political interference, particularly because of the state-owned, state-propelled capitalist system. In India, while the lower courts are corrupt and slow, civil society is much more active. So, for example, if poor people's rights are violated and the poor people are too poor to fight the case in the court, they go and complain to civil society. There is a very strong civil society movement, and they have the right in India to bring what they call public interest litigation, PIL, to the courts. And the high courts and Supreme Courts are very sensitive to that. In fact, many of the environmental issues, for example, or even things like, so children who are supposed to get midday meal in school, if that is not properly implemented, people take a public interest litigation to the High Court. And the High Court gives an injunction to the government, you have to immediately implement it. So public interest litigation, and the court, the judiciary, takes that case much earlier than other cases because that's immediately flash in the media. So you become a hero in the media if you do take an environmental public interest litigation or a children's midday meal scheme. So there is an incentive for the judges because they become heroes in the media. So in that sense, I would say the legal system, for all its flaws, still more active in India than in China.
Thank you very much. I think we need to wrap up really this exciting and very rich conversation. Of course, to talk of giants in an hour and a half, we can't cover more than the feet. But I think this time we have covered a lot more. And that gives us a lot of insightful thinking about the future of Asia or the world as such, what we think as the cooperation opportunities between India and China. On that note, let's give a round of applause for Professor Pranab.